All right, so I have Alex here from 16Zero, and well, we've been trying to make this podcast happen for a while. So thank you for your continued patience with me, Alex. It's great to have you on.
No problem, Dan. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Okay, so this is really cool. This is a bit different to the usual podcast I've been doing, but it's very much tied into the theme of performance. And you're developing a tool, and I think one of the investors or people helping you develop this tool is actually Lurpus. Is that correct?
Yeah, we brought Tommy on pretty early on in the process as a co-founder. He has a lot of super relevant advice, both on the business side, and then obviously he's a super accomplished CounterStrike player.
Okay, so, and this tool, it's an analytical tool, and it's designed to basically take every single piece of data, just pass as much as possible from demos, and to create as much insights that are going to enable the user to create a benefit in the actual game. So can you describe, maybe better than I can, exactly what your tool is doing? Like what is the vision? Where did this idea come from? What's the process been like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess almost taking a step back and forgetting about CounterStrike for 1 second. We obviously saw that there is this trend towards people taking data and using it for these really amazing things to come up with really amazing conclusions, whether or not that's people like Google mapping the world, or even professional sports teams like the Eagles starting to use analytics to make their play better, or the things the NBA is doing. And we looked at CounterStrike and at video games. And the thing that's interesting about video games is they're one of the best natural sources of data that you could come across, because they're entirely digital. So in theory, the whole world is something that can be easily represented in your computer. And that's not true for things like the NBA. It's not true for mapping data, where you have to do things like send satellites into space. And so we sort of thought, really, in video games, we should see some of the most impressive tools for data analysis. Like, we should see professional video game players using these really cool tools that make you a way better player, because they can access every movement update. Every single time you look at an enemy, we can analyze that. And I think one of the things that's amazing about CounterStrike, one amazing stat, is that there's something like 5 million positional updates on average that are available in a standard CSGO demo of like an average length map. And so there should be these amazing things that we can do with that data to make players better, to show them insights about the ways that they're playing, and help them, make better decisions. And so we sort of took this idea of like, let's take a video game and let's use data analysis to sort of take the competition in that video game to the next level. And we tried to apply that idea to CounterStrike. And we did it by basically starting to take professional demos and analyze them, but not just analyze them for kills and for deaths, but try to pull out every single thing that we could out of the demo, and try to, instead of just producing statistics that talk about how many kills a player got, how many deaths a player got, we wanted to talk about statistics that actually focused on the decisions that players were making in game. And so that at a high level is the idea of 16Zero. It's, let's take this professional level data and let's build these profiles of teams that are useful for scouting them, that are useful for understanding how they play, and that are ultimately useful for either making a team better or for beating a team that you might be playing.
So, in Counter-Strike, we're not too familiar with having statistics. I think HLTV, for example, has, they've been developing their own statistics and methods to create insights from those statistics for quite some time. Like, what has been your thoughts of, I suppose, I'm not sure if you consider them competition, but what has been your thoughts on the other attempts at creating insights through data in Counter-Strike so far?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, we love HLTV. I think HLTV has done some amazing things to elevate the Counter-Strike scene, to make some of the data extremely available to sort of a mass audience, put it in a place where people can easily, consume that data and have access to Counter-Strike in a way that, would otherwise require like an ESPN or something coming in, and perhaps not doing it as well as HLTV might be able to. I think our approach was, we're less concerned about bringing Counter-Strike statistics to the average viewer as we are focusing on new ways of understanding the game by focusing really on actionability. So, that's doing things like focusing on, instead of just like how do players play overall, how do players play in specific situations? How much more damage is the player likely to do if he stands, to the left side, on the left side of this angle compared to the right side of this angle? Some of that ends up being really interesting to look at as a viewer as well. So we certainly think there is some like application of what we're doing on the broadcast side, maybe in a way a little bit similar to what HLTV has done. But what we're really focused on is trying to understand like the decisions that players are making and try to inform them in ways that help them actually make better decisions.
So from that perspective, I've been, had a little tour of your tool a while ago, and one of the things I always thought was very interesting is, working out sort of like the expected value of this, that, and the other, coming from the poker world, where that's kind of how you do it. And, you're able to get to that point because you have this incredible sample size of data. You've got, you're thinking about a strategy over a sample size of like 100,000 hands that you can analyze very easily if you have the right sort of management tool in poker. And, so then I went to these other esports games, and I was always trying to think of it in those terms, but it's just too difficult. We just don't have the tools to parse that amount of data and to create those insights. And I feel like you have the first tool that's really accomplished that, and I think you're getting the kind of the closest to basically working out what actually is a plus EV play. Like, how can you actually calculate that, and how can you actually calculate what is what is the percentage advantage to taking, let's say, a certain area of the map on let's say dust 2. Let's say, if you take long, for example, and you lose a player doing it, you go down 4 versus 5 on the T side. Has it actually improved your chances to win the round, or has it improved your chances to get a bomb down, but maybe overall lessen the chances to win the round? Like, these kinds of things I've always been fascinated in learning, and I feel like you guys are the closest to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've certainly made a lot of strides, and I obviously I think there's a huge way to go from what we've done so far. I mean, one of the things that first really excited me about the project, one of the first pieces of technology that we built that I felt like actually perhaps contributed something to the discussion of, what makes a player good, what makes a player bad, is what we call our damage map. But what it basically is, anytime a player does damage to another player, there's obviously like 2 positions associated with that damage event. And so there's sort of like a positive damage position for the person who did the damage, and there's a negative damage position. And you can start to do really cool things like group all those damage events for all the in damage events and all the out damage events for a particular player across an entire map. And you can start to do really powerful things like identify specifically, sort of like you were talking about, if a player's in this particular spot, how much more damage is he likely to do than he's likely to receive. In terms of being able to really make this actionable for players, I think that's been a little bit more of a struggle, because it's one thing to sort of be able to step back and to say, this player does 10 more damage when he's in this position than when he's in this other position. But the struggle, I think, is how do we take these insights and make it something that's actually useful to a player who has to make a decision in, let's say half a second, or, best case scenario, 2 or 3 seconds, when you're talking about like, do I rotate, through tunnels, or do I try to like retake B site dust 2, from T mid? And sort of distilling a lot of this data down to things that are actually focused on the decisions that players are making, is still something that we're continuing to work towards. I think we made a lot of strides, but it's just such a huge project.
Yes, it's amazing because, again, like if you can pull the data, it's just sort of making sense of it, right? And I feel like, for example, in hearing that, if you're hearing the example you just gave with the damage mapping, if we're looking at a position, let's say like ticket booth, and you're looking at the CT, and you're trying to see, okay, these are the sort of spots and angles in which he's able to do the most damage from that. Someone might be thinking whilst listening to what you were saying and thinking to themselves, okay, well, but that might be ignoring, what's the context? So, what happened in like some of those rounds? Like, it obviously in certain specific environments, you're going to be able to get way more damage out of a spot than if like a certain type of execute's coming in, or based on the weapon that you have, or the weapons your opponents have, and so on and so forth. And that's actually something that your tool can account for as well, right? Because you have all the ways to filter for specific rounds. So you could maybe say you put device in that position and look at all the Astralis demos on Mirage, you could device in that position, and you could filter out, okay, buy versus buy, okay, the A execute comes in, right? So then you actually solve that problem of context. Would you say that's accurate?
I think filterability is something that we have taken very seriously, sort of from an early stage in the process. It really does give you the ability, and I think this is one of the ways our tool sort of goes to the next level, is we really focus on giving our users the ability to narrow down to the exact situations that they care about. And we do think that actually contributes to sort of be what we like to call actionable analytics. Like these analytics are actually focused on decision making. And identifying characteristics, like things that you just talked about, like buy versus buy, situations when device in particular has an op, situations where, the economic situation maybe based on the winning streaks and losing streaks is such that it's what we might call like an economically important round, which is a round where you are more likely to basically either team is going to be in a bad position if they lose the round. And so these tend to be extremely crucial rounds to who wins the entire match. And so often, it's nice for players and coaches to be able to narrow down to specifically those rounds and focus on, either just watching those rounds or looking at statistics that are just focused on those rounds. And so we try to do that in a lot of the tools that we offer, not just offer interesting ways of like visualizing data, but also offering really powerful ways of navigating these vast quantities of data. And that, I think, is something that really appeals to coaches and players in particular, because unlike me at least, like I'm not always necessary, as I built a lot of these tools, I'm not a pro player. I don't even have a background as like a extremely strong Counter-Strike player. I mean, I'm no novice, but I'm certainly probably most people listening to this podcast would beat me pretty handily. So focusing on putting the power and the tools in the hands of our users is one of the reasons that we've focused so much on filterability and on giving players the ability to narrow down to, not only economically important rounds, but rounds where a team attacked A or rounds where a team attacked B, so that, like A site players and B site players can focus on the rounds that are only relevant to them when they're prepping. Because you have a lot of these superstar players who like obviously have these incredibly back schedules. And, part of our job is to make their time as easy as possible. And so, that's why we've tried to build these tools that, waste as little time as possible. So you don't have to flick through round after round after round. You can just focus on the things that are really relevant to helping you make better decisions.
And speaking of which, it's been so interesting at the time of this podcast, especially because, and I watched today, Face It, they released this cool documentary. I think they call it Turning Point, and they were looking at coaches, and one of the coaches they were focusing on was Zeus, and he had this cool story where he's like, I'll never forget this moment. It was coaching Luminosity. It was against Na'Vi at MLG Columbus, the major, and there was this Mirage, and there was this, we just kept getting battered every time we would throw this smoke, and then eventually he realized that by throwing a specific smoke down mid, it actually would encourage Na'Vi to have a specific response. And then he kind of worked out that, this created like a specific timing window that if, they would then push, let's say really fast on B apps or Palace or something, or, towards A, that the Na'Vi would just be out of position, and then they just lost the round. And this is like an insight that he had very quickly from a gut feeling, and then that allowed them to win the game. And one of the cool things about your tool that I find fascinating as well is that you can see with the filterability that you're talking about, how the rotations actually work for teams. And not only that, I throw a bunch of smokes or put a bunch of smokes down with your tool, and I can see in buy rounds, let's say maybe how Astralis most often will respond from a rotation perspective. The fact that you can also view it in a 2D is really cool. And also, don't you have on there, because you did a tour with me a while ago, you have a functionality which allows you to see the individual POVs as well.
Yeah. So for matches, we'll basically give you, our 2D player, which is like an overview player of the map, shows you all the smokes, all the player positions, pretty much everything from a top-down perspective. I think it's a little bit prettier than the one in game, but it's more or less gives you the same information. And then, we'll also give you the ability to jump into POVs as well, because we found that, the 2D player is nice for some things. It's way better, in my opinion, for identifying strategic decision-making, things like you were just talking about, like how does the team respond to a particular smoke? That stuff can be really hard to see when you're looking at things in POV. But then, of course, there's all these other things that might matter for an individual player. So, if your device let's say you're trying to research device, you're trying to understand how he peeks, mid mirage window, it's not so useful to get a top-down perspective of what he looks like, what he's doing. It's much better if you can watch 10 rounds of exactly how he's peeking the window, and so you can start to identify trends about how he decides to peek. And so we sort of try to make everything available, because depending on who the user is, there's obviously like a couple of different levels of utility and what they're exactly looking for. But we definitely thought the POV stuff was super important for our tool to be like really useful for people playing at the highest level, because those small micro tendencies they matter so much.
And speaking of the POV thing, firstly, like it's obviously got to be that's got to be the biggest money sink, surely.
Yeah, I think we have 10 terabytes of video footage at the moment. So it definitely requires a bit of resources from our end. It's not the worst thing in the world, but we definitely we have hardware running 24/7 that's like responsible for processing some of those POVs and stuff like that. So it's definitely like a non-trivial undertaking.
So another thing that POVs would be really interesting for is obviously understanding grenades. So what kind of tools do you have around grenades? Because you did throw some credit towards HLTV previously, and something that they have done, which has been really cool, is like they actually introduced a lot of these sort of grenade stats, which allowed us to get a more colored, a better depth of let's say picture to what is actually happening as far as like who's contributing impact. So what sort of stuff do you have around grenades? Because I know you have a tab for grenades. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, grenades are obviously really important in CounterStrike, and I think they're one of the most interesting sort of unique features about the game. One of the things there's some basic things that we do. I think actually one of the things you sort of even mentioned, which is obviously, like Zeus loves to understand, what does the team's rotations or positions look like based on a particular smoke being thrown. We have a tool that does something similar to that, which is like, it lets you condition a lot of tools based on a smoke being in a particular spot or a grenade being thrown in a particular area. The other thing that's really interesting about smoke grenades or like grenades in general is that players learn these lineups. And so they're sort of throwing the same grenade again and again. And we really wanted to understand the decision-making that goes behind grenades. Like, why do you throw this particular HE at this particular time as opposed to this other HE? And key to understanding that was being able to do things like identify lineups. So one of the things that we did actually pretty early on in the process was we built this algorithm that uses some basic AI techniques to sort of identify grenades that are probably from the same lineup. So obviously you're going to be off by a couple of pixels every time you throw a grenade, but if we are clever about it, we can more or less automatically figure out which grenades are from the same lineup, and then we can start to do really interesting things like look at particular lineups, and instead of just saying like, oh hey, this player throws really great flash grenades, or Astralis does a lot of HE damage, we can actually look at the individual grenades that they're throwing and talk about how effective the grenades are in isolation. And so being able to look at those sort of trends, helps us start to even do things like make micro recommendations to players. Like, let's throw this. Maybe if you threw this grenade a little bit later, you might do a little bit more damage. One example that I think, I'm not sure we ever talked about this in public, but we found sort of behind the scenes was, for a while, Rush was throwing this grenade on A-site Mirage on CT side that was basically like a dud. It would do on average, 1 damage, or maybe it did 1 or 2 points of damage like once or twice, and he'd thrown it like 80 times. And, from our perspective, that might be something that Valens wants him throwing, because perhaps it does deter teams from taking, like early ramp control. But also it might just be something that he does because it's habit, and it might be better for him to throw it a little bit later. And so once we start to understand like grenades by lineup, we can start making micro recommendations instead of just saying like, hey, Rush, it would be great if you had like a higher HE average, and sort of, leaving him to figure out how to do that. We tried to build these tools around grenades that, again, like focused on the actual decisions that players have to make, which is like, do I throw one of these three lineups from this position? So yeah, I mean, I would say that's the grenade functionality at a pretty high level. We've also tried to start to use that to do things like identify executes, which is like another sort of interesting thing about professional Counter-Strike that we just like find fascinating from an analytical perspective. And so, we love the ability of being able to like model that and talk to teams about the executes that they're running, in like an automated way.
So it's one of the cool things about this product is that, you have, it's so amazing in for professional players and teams, and it's so amazing for the broadcast, and it's so amazing for casual players because it's just data and you just give it meaning, and it's actionable, as you said. Like that's just a beautiful concept. And so firstly, I wonder, you guys must surely have spoken about the idea to create a tool that, or like a sort of an extension of this tool that goes in game and gives you visualizations. So for example, if you're running around a server, maybe there's like a pop-up display that says, okay, these are the must-know grenades for Mirage on the T side, and then you can click them, and you can click one, and it can be window smoke, and it can give you a few variations of a window smoke and show you exactly where to stand, how to do the lineup. Like, is that something that you've also considered? Because you have the data for like everything, right? So surely that's in theory possible.
I think there's a ton of sort of interesting concepts that not a ton of which we haven't really dug super deep into. But that sort of surrounds, how can we integrate some of this technology with the game? So, stuff like you mentioned, right, which is let's show specific grenade recommendations, but even things like, being able to, like, let's say you're Navi and you have a match against Liquid, and you want to know what some of their common executes look like. Being able to do things like stand on a site and have the smokes for one of their common executes like thrown against you sort of automatically by this tool. That's sort of like just some stuff that we haven't really done, but we've definitely thought about. I think there's like some incredibly interesting concepts there. Also, I mean, going back to the damage map tool, being able to do stuff like have you walk around the map and tell you, hey, based on your past performances, like you're plus 42 damage from this spot, you're minus 12 damage from this spot, so that maybe you can go practice against bots and also get this information to make these like smaller adjustments while you're playing the game. The one thing that's kind of interesting from this is understanding what the line is. I think one thing that we saw that's kind of interesting, and I'm not sure if people listening to this podcast will be familiar, but in Overwatch, there's this company called Visor that was doing something kind of similar to what we're doing. But they were offering like a lot of in-game feedback or sort of immediate recommendations, telling you like interesting things about your play while you're playing an actual match. And despite the fact that they weren't this wasn't a hack, it wasn't stealing data from the game, it was completely based off of like the video feed. Blizzard ended up saying something along the lines of, this third-party program running inside your game more or less, ends up is basically the same thing as a cheat. And so Visor basically got sort of slapped by Blizzard about that. And so, from our perspective, we're sort of careful when we dig into these in-game tools, because there is a question of like, at what point is it unacceptable for us to like give you feedback while you were playing? I mean, I think most people would agree that if like pros were running some kind of overlay that like, let's say was based on, solely on information that we could see on their screen, if they were doing that in a tournament, it would probably be like over the line. And most people would probably say like the smoke tool that you described is not over the line because you're like doing it in an offline server. So trying to figure out like where the line there is there in terms of like competitive integrity is really interesting to us. Because like in video games, because there's so much data, this isn't something that we've like ventured into in sports. Like there's no equivalent to having like a incredible heads up display in like soccer that's telling you like where to run. There might be some more comparable examples that I'm not really familiar with in things like poker, but it's like a really interesting problem from our perspective where we actually should stop building technology, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, it's one of the questions I was going to ask is this idea of, if you imagine that this tool is there for professional players, and even if you still maintain that human element, that the human being is still playing the game and is limited by their human perception and their practice and everything like that, as things are now. That's one thing, but is the game, do you think, in some ways, will the competitive integrity be sullied? Will the game become a bit more boring, maybe? Because let's say in 5 years, there's so much data on how Counter-Strike works and in its most effective capacities, and then everyone's going to learn those models, and then it's going to just become sort of a rock, paper, scissors of a metagame, as opposed to something that's just a little bit more ambiguous, which gives it some of that extra flair because you just don't know what's going to happen, and that's part of what's exciting about the sport. Have you given that idea?
Yeah, we definitely thought about that a bit. Personally, I actually think if anything, it will make the game more compelling and more engaging. I think I don't think you would ever see people sort of playing strictly by the numbers, just because there's always going to be information that you have that is like sort of forever going to be hard to represent in a model. So we may know a ton about how Astralis plays on Nuke, but we may not know how much a team that's about to play Astralis has practiced on Nuke. We don't know like what their results might look like offline, and so I really think our understanding of like the meta game, the perfect way of playing Counter-Strike, will always be a little bit imprecise. Like we'll never have all of the data, partially because like the game exists, like there are decisions that are made that are outside of the scope of the game. And so even these extremely rich demos don't have all the data. But I think there's also the human element, which is that, you have 20 somethings, also, 16, 17, 18-year-olds playing this game, and getting them to live out a like quantitative model while they're playing the game is just never going to happen. And nor do I think we would want it to happen. Like a lot of the game is obviously played on instinct. And I don't think we will ever completely change that. But I do hope that there are things around the edges that we can use our software to help tighten up, help people make decisions, stop making decisions that are like obviously the bad decision. And I think that will make Counter-Strike more competitive as a result. The other thing is I think like our software hopefully eventually make competing at a extremely high level even more accessible to teams that can't do things like afford a bunch of analysts, for example, to constantly sort of scout the people they're playing. So I think there's a lot of elements there that will hopefully keep the competition alive.
Yeah, the accessibility thing is pretty cool. You never really want it to be the question of who has the most money, who can buy the best players type thing that you might get in some sports, which would, I guess, be somewhat of the equivalent in that instance. So I have a really interesting question, actually. I hadn't thought about this before, but one of the problems we have in Counter-Strike is, I would say personally, is the lack of, let's say, maps. We don't have enough maps coming into the competitive pool. If there was, in a perfect world, if you can release like a really esports ready, like professional level Counter-Strike map that can be played in a major like twice a year at least, that's going to freshen things up massively. It's going to remove some of that viewer fatigue. You're going to get to see new stuff. Because I think whenever I ask people, when was the last time you saw something like really innovative in a game of Counter-Strike, something that blew your mind in professional Counter-Strike? It's very hard for people to think of it because we just see very slight variations, which really is just the metagame, generally speaking, changing, and it's rare that we see something brand new and mind-blowing. And so I was wondering that if this tool, in theory, could make that process easier to learn new maps, because would you be able to, let's say, project like if you just put a new map into your system, because you have all the data on, let's say, like let's say the damage maps, like you surely must be able to say, okay, based on like there's a reason why this spot is better than that spot, and maybe there's like geometric advantages which are really easy to quantify from a let's say it's very easy to win this duel because of this geometric advantage, and that's obviously a mechanic in the game as well. So would it, do you think, be something that could allow us to more easily transition into new maps as opposed to just having to run around them constantly and figure everything out? Will this tool be able to make that an easier process?
Yeah, I think certainly there is room for us to turn this tool into something that can make that process significantly easier. I mean, both from the perspective of it's just going to be easier for you to review play on that map as it does play out, but also from the perspective of making predictions about which areas are going to be important to have map control and stuff like that. I'm not sure that we're completely there yet, but personally, I find some of the concepts of like, how does the field of view that you have from this particular spot, make that spot important for map control? Like if you can see two critical junctures of the map, the spot you're in is probably, significantly more important than, some spot where you have a very limited field of view over a perhaps like ancillary, like off to the edge type area. Can we make predictions about, what are going to be the good spots on a new map if, we start playing Sub-Zero or whatever? I think we definitely can, but I also think like we have a bit of a way to go before it's easy for us to look at a particular spot and, talk about like how the geometry actually makes, one spot better than the other without actually like seeing a lot of play on it. The other thing is I kind of wonder to what extent the metagame in Counter-Strike is a little bit unpredictable. Like I wonder to what extent it's determined based on what spots are the like actually the best from like a geometric perspective, or where there's sort of situations where players have learned to effectively play a very particular position in an effective way, and other players have sort of just started to copy that style. I'm not really sure to what extent each of those factors actually determines the metagame, but that's the kind of stuff that we're like really interested in exploring. But we've really only begun to chip away at what we think is like a pretty big iceberg there.
Yeah, there's no kidding. I mean, when I was asked, like, sort of thinking about that last question that I asked you about understanding, like, just having a fresh map with no data and your tool already understanding what the good spots might be based on how it understands Counter-Strike, that the next step for that is actually for the tool to be able to construct maps, basically. If obviously you'd have to give it some criteria, but that would be really interesting as well. Do you think that would be something that does that sound like an interesting concept to you? Have you talked about it already?
I mean, I've actually never really considered the idea of auto building maps. I mean, I think obviously it would have to be like if you were to do that, it'd have to be pretty limited in the sense of like you might be able to do something like suggest a layout and leave it to a creative mapper to actually figure out how to put it together in a way that like looked good and people actually wanted to play on. But I do think that there are sort of interesting things that we might be able to learn about the game that I'm not even sure that the CSGO devs really have a ton of insight into. I think we often see, like, I think one great example from a mapping perspective is how does verticality affect, the competitiveness of a particular map? Because I think we've seen on Nuke that it certainly creates a much different game, because almost never in the Counter-Strike world do you find yourself like constantly having to worry about such a like high degree of verticality when you're playing a map. Like often you're pretty much just looking in front of you and, sort of to the left and to the right. And I think it's sort of also an open question for the community. Like what makes a map good? Like, what are we looking for? Are we looking for situations where every map finishes 16-14, or are we looking for situations that reward the team where the higher skilled team always wins? These are sort of other questions that I think, we'd also have to answer before we could really figure out if we could like build a map in an automated way.
Has there been anything about the tool so far, like in developing it, that surprised you? Like, something that you, an insight that you got which you just really weren't expecting, or an application you weren't expecting?
Yeah. So one of my favorite tools that we've worked on, we call engagement analytics, but basically what it is we look at these periods of time where one player can see another player on the map. So an engagement basically starts when I see you and ends when I stop seeing you, whether or not that means I die or you go behind a wall or I go behind a wall. And we can use like engagements to actually start talking about mechanical skill in some pretty interesting ways. We can do stuff like look at crosshair placement, some proxies for reaction time based on, how long it takes you to actually, fire a shot at a player. And so we've obviously gotten to look at some statistics that I think haven't really been measured before in CounterStrike. And the thing that's interesting is mechanical skill is definitely important. I think we see a lot of the players that we think as the high mechanical skill players towards the top on some of those numbers, but it's not as straightforward as you would think. And I often think that probably a lot of it comes out in the wash, and a lot of what makes players really good is actually their decision making, more so than, their ability to hit a shot in 20 milliseconds faster than one of their competitors. It really has to do with like, are you peaking at the right place at the right time? And that's not to say that the mechanical skill doesn't matter, but I think it would surprise a lot of people how much those numbers don't really seem to be predictive in the sense of telling you who's going to win a particular duel.
And speaking of which, one of the other unquantifiables that might be interesting, and also from an insight perspective, I wonder if it somehow comes out in the data, is consistency. And obviously consistency is often down to the psychology of a player, because as you say, like it could often be that you can make really good decisions, and so if we assume that someone makes the best decisions, but then there's still a variance in their ability to successfully execute the play, then there's a level of inconsistency which will vary between players. So and perhaps if you're able to see, okay, I am making good decisions fairly consistently, but the execution is a problem, then perhaps that can lead them towards a greater insight into their performance and where they need to go next. Is consistency a thing that you've discussed as well, a way to like understand that?
Yeah, so we've measured consistency in a couple of different ways. One thing that I think is kind of interesting to look at, that I'm not sure I have any real conclusions on, is one thing we were really interested in the beginning was, okay, so we have these players who, are doing, obviously everyone knows about ADR, which is like average damage per round. How consistently are these players that are doing, let's say, 89 damage per round and tend to be towards the top of the leaderboard? Is there a difference between two players that are both doing 87 damage a round? Like, would you prefer the player that consistently does 87 damage, or would you prefer the player that, sometimes does 300 damage and then the rest of the time, does 0 damage, but it averages out to 87? And so, like, understanding consistency in some of these statistics are things that we've definitely started to look into. I think the jury's still out on, what some of those statistics mean and to what extent they relate to things like psychological consistency. But the other thing that's interesting, I think, is like from the mechanical perspective, we think it's really interesting to start to understand things which we can start to do with some of these statistics. Like, do players actually play worse when they have to wake up in the mornings? Like, I know when we were originally talking to Renegades, they were sort of interested in digging into, for some of their players, are there particular conditions under which they actually play their best games? Like, is it good for some players to sleep 12 hours a night? Is it good for other players to sleep 8 hours a night? And I think we're sort of just at the beginning of being able to answer those questions, because it's really hard to do that when you have things like, just rounds to look at and just damage as metrics. Because those metrics can be a little bit misleading in terms of understanding, what does this actually mean? How does this relate to a player's physiological well-being going into a match?
Yeah, I guess so. At 16Zero, wearable tech coming to stores near you soon.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, most of the stuff we've been doing is super basic, just like schedule based stuff. But if there's anyone out there listening that knows anything about wearable tech and wants to partner with us, we're happy to talk about it.
Man, it's really fascinating, like all of these insights, and also it must be when you're talking about sort of the jury being out on the consistency and the using the example that you use with ADR. Do you want this player or that player? It also feels like you're in a position where maybe you can debunk some of maybe some prominently considered notions about statistics that we do have, or perhaps help to redefine the way that we look at the game in certain respects. Like, for example, what a support player's impact actually is. I think that you guys have, again, looking at the grenade statistics, you have this ability to look at the data in such a way that's so detailed that you can get a much finer balance on player statistics, because there's always been this really difficult thing for players who, in the public eye, maybe they just see they just see the outcome of the amount of kills that you get to be the quality of player that you are, and things did get a little bit more complicated than that, but it still feels like there's not a great representation to actually really understand like who is a very good player, because as much as we talk about roles and simplify things with roles, which again, Counter-Strike is beautiful because there are no specific roles. It's not a class-based game. Anybody can really achieve sort of anything in any given scenario. It's just sort of how they fit into the structure of a team. It feels like maybe your tool could maybe offer more insight into redefining some of the roles.
Yeah. So, I think one interesting example that recently was this when Stico came back to mouse sports. We compared some of his statistics with Snacks and tried to understand what the impact was on the rest of the team, because I think there were arguments both ways. I think we actually did a Twitter thread on this, but there were some arguments both ways about ways in which Stico was an asset to the team, and perhaps ways in which he might have hurt the team a little bit. But it is interesting to start to be able to dig into things like, for example, we noticed when Stico left the team, there were certain grenades that other people had to like step up and start throwing a lot more of. And so understanding like that Stico actually did fit this particular role in the team, and that, even if he wasn't throwing grenades that were necessarily better than the grenades that were being thrown by some of the other players on the team, they potentially put other players in a position where, because they weren't throwing those grenades, they played significantly better and they were more successful. And so we are really excited about being able to start looking at some of those things. Also being able to like talk to players about how they can use statistics to make a case for their value. Because right now it's really difficult if you don't have access to really advanced statistics, particularly around things like, nade usage, and you don't have ways of understanding like the value kill based on the economic situation. You can often reach misleading conclusions. And so we're eager for this kind of stuff to be out there, because it means that players can start to have discussions like during contract negotiations and have a better understanding of their value to a team in ways that like they can't right now, because maybe they're not like an all-star fragger. And so their skill and success doesn't come out in ADR alone or in KPR alone. So there's definitely a role there. And we're excited to like continue to do interesting work in that direction. But like understanding things like role, again, like I know I've been saying this a lot in this podcast. I think we're really at the beginning of, understanding what makes a support player from a statistical perspective compared to just the eye test.
It's it's so exciting, just like all the possibilities, because you just have the data. You just like have a way to pass the data, and it's just like finding the ways. Like it's the right questions, isn't it? It's always about finding the right questions. And another question I have is about you touched on it very briefly a moment ago. Is mechanics, and I know you have this. You've shown on Twitter especially as well, just like this crosshair placement or the, analysis, which does speak to mechanics partly as well as other things. But one of the things I've noticed a lot in different players, in that I might coach in certain people, is understanding how best to look at their setup. So, and because if I look at them playing, I can see, hang on, this guy, he's having problems resetting his mouse. Like he's having problems turning enough degrees in one sweep with the kind, and that's down to a technique thing. Like he's using either like a poor grip or a poor technique, or a mouse that doesn't fit correctly, or his sensitivity is not correct as well. So like that's something I can tell by just looking at how someone moves, and it's very easy for anybody to do that just by looking at someone who's got good mechanics, who's a professional player, and then looking at their friend who's gold nova. Like you can see significant differences, and that's down to mechanics. So I feel like is that's something that your tool could offer insights on as well, right? If you are able to just analyze a demo and understand like how smooth is this motion, how quickly can you go from this position to that position, how smooth is it? Because if you want to do a left to right flick, let's say it's an 80 degrees flick, which shouldn't be something that's too demanding. If that's a struggle for you to snap like that, then maybe there's an issue somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, we are very, very interested in potentially building tools that can be useful, even for players who are new to the game, or players who just want to improve. Start offering them automated ways of getting sort of this type of coaching. I think one of the things we struggle with, and one of the reasons I think we started building things on the professional side, is we need this sort of level of expert advice. It's really important because we're certainly good, and we have people on the team who are very good at data analysis and very good at building scalable systems. And this is one of the reasons, of course, that we also brought Tommy on board. But we need this ecosystem around the product of professionals who are interested in it and are willing to talk to us about, hey, what is it that makes players aim bad? Because often it may be obvious to you looking at a player who's not so skilled, but perhaps it's not obvious to me. Perhaps it is obvious, but we always need that expert advice to start designing metrics, because really what we're trying to do is design metrics that capture the intuitions that we have, so that we can sort of automate those intuitions. We can make this type of coaching accessible to everyone, or we can apply it on such a large scale that we can get these insights that would only be possible if you watched 100 demos and like meticulously recorded notes. And so we certainly think that kind of stuff is possible, and we've definitely started to work towards it in some of the smaller projects that we've been working on. But it really does require real experts coming in and helping us move the product forward by helping point out what some of those flaws might be in a player, so we can build these tools to identify them automatically.
It's so exciting. The one thing about this is that there must be something about this project so far though that you yourself that you're super proud of, something that you achieved, and that might be like a weird question, because actually it does seem like you've done an enormous amount of the development by yourself, and it's a crazy small team. But if you could pick out one thing that you're really proud of so far that you've developed, what would it be?
This is a good question. I think probably the thing that comes to mind for the tools we've built to automatically identify executes, just because this is like one of the things about the game that we all sort of see. We all know the executes are happening, and you obviously memorize your executes when you're learning how to play the game, maybe with like some friends or whatever. It was very rewarding the first time that we managed to run this over, 15 North demos or 15 Astralis demos. And, we got a list back that was like, a list of the 6 times that Astralis had run, their A-Site Mirage execute or whatever. And obviously those tools, even to this day, require some tuning, and there's always improvement to be made. But there was something very satisfying about sort of saying, hey, this is like a phenomenon we want to talk about in a statistical way, and building the layers of tools that it required to actually get the results that we wanted. Sort of finally seeing that pop up on the screen the way that you wanted is a pretty satisfying feeling.
do you need investment, or like, what kind of stage are you at in the business? Like, if you had this platform to sort of make an appeal to anyone that's interested in supporting the project, what ways could they go about doing that?
Well, I guess there's a couple of different ways depending on who you are. I mean, if you're a professional player or a professional team, and are interested in like learning about the products and potentially becoming a customer, that obviously helps us a lot. We're definitely looking for investment. We've started the process of potentially trying to raise a seed round. So if there are people out there who are like sort of interested in hearing our pitch and what we think the company can do in the long run, feel free to reach out to us at contact@sixteenzero.net, and we're certainly open to chatting. I think what we really do need is ultimately, at the end of the day, we need to continue to build our customer base and or get investment, because we're all sort of, everyone at 16Zero is very interested in making this a full-time thing, but none of us are full-time yet. And so we're definitely making progress towards that point. Like we've continued to sell the products to, more professional teams as time has gone on. So we know that there's definitely like a space for what we're doing. But we're definitely still trying to get to the point where we can all quit our day jobs and make this something that is full time. But I mean, I would say maybe even at the close, like, in my opinion, this is about so much more than just CounterStrike. CounterStrike is obviously like our first sport, and we absolutely love it. But as esports continues to grow and as video games continue to grow, data analytics in video games is going to become some of the most compelling and engaging analytics that you'll see. It'll be more engaging than sports. It will be more engaging than using Google Maps, because all of that data is going to be stuff that is easily accessible for companies like us. And so we're really excited just about not only what can be done in CounterStrike, but how this is potentially going to be foundational to like what esports and what video games are going to grow into as they continue to flourish as an industry.
Fantastic. I completely agree with you. And, there's got to be so many people as well who are not necessarily sort of, professionals or on the business end of things that might be listening and just wondering, they must be salivating, how can I get my hands on this tool? When is it going to, reach the average sort of casual player, or, is there going to be a a release soon that will allow anybody to look at it?
Yeah, we are hoping to move towards a player market. We're definitely building tools in that direction. I think if you are one of those people and you're like, oh hey, I would really love to get my hands on some of these tools, certainly reach out to us, and there may be a possibility that we will need beta testers sometime in the near future. I don't want to speak too much about our plans for those products, and we definitely don't have like a concrete release date, but what I will say is that we're definitely moving in that direction. And we do want to make this stuff available to, pretty much anyone who's playing CounterStrike, at least in some capacity. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, feel free to reach out as well. We always need more testers.
And if people want to follow the progress and to get more information, what are your sort of socials where they can find all that?
So at 16Zero is our Twitter account. We post there pretty regularly. My personal Twitter is at yohg CSGO. And there's also our website, 16zero.net, where we do have a blog that we occasionally post some interesting stuff on. So, but if you follow us on Twitter, you'll probably get most of our stuff.
Amazing. Well, I think that about does it for my questioning for now. But I'm pretty sure that also based on the feedback of this, I think there's going to be some great follow-up discussions. I think analytics, as you say, is such a deep topic, and it's been great to hear your thoughts on it and to get sort of another look into sort of what you've been doing and to pick your brain more. So thank you, Alex, so much for taking the time to chat with me.
Thanks, Dan. It's been a real pleasure.